everyone. I am back with an album review from the past. I know it has been a long time since I have done any full-length album reviews on this channel. Please bear with me. It's just the way things are going to be. And I was debating what I wanted to finally review, after so long. And I thought, there's an album that I've been told I really need to pay attention to, but I didn't really familiarize myself with it until just a few weeks ago, or maybe about a month. It's been within the last month, very much a big part of my life, this record. And it serves as a gateway to this artist for me, an artist who I have been familiar with, but only in name recognition and only in comparison to other artists and cover songs. And I finally thought, you know what, it's about time I really dive into this incredible, ingenious, creative songwriter's catalog. And that is, of course, the UK musician Kate Bush. So I'm going to be reviewing her fifth studio record, Hounds of Love, which was released on the 16th of September, 1985. And as I said, it's her fifth album, and it's considered by many critics and Kate Bush fans alike to be her best, and a very good album in terms of introducing yourself to her material, as it's very avant-garde in many ways, but it also doesn't, some of the most inaccessible songs in her catalog, like the previous album that precedes it, called Dreaming, which is considered to be some of her most inaccessible, but it feels a little bit, as many people say, fully formed and more better sculpted on Hounds of Love as like a finished product that it basks in the spotlight better. And I have watched and heard amazing things be said about this record, so I was like, I've got to dive into this and figure this out for myself. What do I think? The first track on this record, Running Up That Hill, parentheses, A Deal with God, is a song that I had heard of before. I would have had to have literally been living under a rock not to have heard of this song, as it was one of the biggest hits for Kate Bush, particularly in the US. She never really broke into the mainstream of the US market in the late 70s, early 80s when she was beginning and debuting with her first few albums in the UK. They never really reached across the pond, so to speak, until this song, which came out in anticipation of the album. And so I've heard it done mainly by covers by different artists. And I had seen and watched the music video, and it was the one sort of go-to Kate Bush song, name one, that's the one everyone thinks of. And I will say that this song, in completion with the whole record, really adds more depth to the understanding of where she's coming from in terms of writing these songs. But this song always stood out and had this impact on me. But I will say that because I'd heard this song already, there is an element of it not being so new or exciting. So all of the other songs are like brand new and I'd never heard them before. And then this song was just sort of like, oh, and I've heard that one a lot, but it's still amazing, but I can only imagine hearing it for the first time. Just a bit more background info. This album is separated out into two parts, which I think is really interesting. Back when, you had vinyls and they were the big thing, you had an A side and a B side. And so the A side is full of all the singles, and that's the first 5 tracks on this record. The remaining, is it 6? My brain's not fully functioning. I believe it's 6 songs that are one continuous song, like a suite, is on side B. And that side is called the Ninth Wave. And it's actually quite different in some ways from the singles, which are obviously a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more pop, a little bit more catchy, memorable in that regard. But the depth is extremely, extremely fascinating on the Ninth Wave. And the composition and almost esoteric exploration that is delved upon in the second half really makes that part stand out in mind much more. Even though that's not to put a slight on the amazing, more kind of upbeat pop songs that are at the beginning of this record. For anyone who is not familiar with Kate Bush, which is probably very few people who are clicking on this video, but I will just go into it, she has been considered, a very huge inspiration for artists like Florence Welch, for artists like Björk, for artists like St. Vincent. A lot of female artists who embrace pop, but embrace it in a slightly more either electronic or a slightly more avant-garde approach. Even, you can think of Lady Gaga with that term art pop. Art pop was used a lot to describe Kate Bush's music. That term seems kind of, it's kind of weird to apply to artists now because of what Lady Gaga did with that term, but that term really does describe her sound. And Kate Bush's, sonic kind of oeuvre and producers that she worked with and people, these things kind of all changed and shifted as she matured in her career. A big breakthrough happened when she discovered something called the Fairlight synthesizer, which was this big mind-blowing thing for Kate when she discovered it in the early 80s. And her previous album used it a lot. And then she also kind of were all over with this electronic device, which doesn't sound too dated to our ears today. There's really nothing about this record that sounds dated. It actually sounds very timeless and in many ways almost futuristic. And there is, I think, something very kind of classical about her vocal, which is very, I would say her vocal sounds very broad and almost operatic in parts. It has a theatrical element to it. And it makes her sound, I think, a little bit older than she is when she's performing these songs, in her 20s. Just because her voice is so full bodied, and that's not a bad thing. That's actually a really, I think, amazing feat. Because it just is such a mature, rich voice that is unmistakable now that I've gotten familiar with her music. And I think that some critics noted that her vocals became more refined and that her earlier singles were a little bit, some might call shrill, where she was, getting a little bit, if anyone's familiar with Joanna Newsom, well, there's, the sound of like people who aren't fans of that kind of music consider it to be like a little bit hissy or a little bit like a cat got something stuck in their throat. I can understand where they're coming from because I do also listen to pop music, but I can appreciate different types of vocal styles, and some are a little bit more avant-garde and not immediately as recognizable as pleasing to the ear. But that doesn't mean that they're not worth repeated listens and kind of just getting used to, because they're actually quite interesting once you dissect the flavors of the vocals. So her voice seems to have leveled out a little bit at this point. And there isn't so much of that shrillness in the high-pitched areas of her voice. It's definitely a lot richer and I think a lot more focused in terms of pitch and sound. Okay, before I ramble on too much, Running Up That Hill conceptually was a song that came about originally about the idea of if a man and woman could swap places and see each other from the other's perspective, there would be a greater understanding between the two, which she considered to be very opposite forces. And eventually, she decided to bring this to another level by, instead of it just being about gender, it was turned into a thing about spirituality, and also the idea of human versus spiritual God figure, whatever you want to call it. The nice thing about a song that has God in its title is that it does not feel heavy-handedly Christian or even that religious. She actually was originally going to call it the song just A Deal with God, but thought that the title, having God in it, was going to make it a little controversial for some countries, and so decided Running Up That Hill was going to be the official title. The propelling nature of this song and the way it matches with the choreography, which is a lot more refined and classical in style from Kate Bush's previous music videos, which, if you're familiar with, are a lot more ecstatic and erratic. In terms of her dance moves, it was a lot more kind of chaotic and a little bit childish, but it was all really, really alluring to see. This time she's, incorporating traditional dance steps to create a choreographed body of work that shows, I think, the dynamic between a man and a woman. And beyond that, it feels a lot more than just a love song. It feels very existential. And there is, in the backing, some sort of sense of building, of something ominous kind of underneath the surface. And I think the undertone of spirituality, which is sort of doused over this song, makes it something you really actually have to think a lot about, because there is something so much deeper than some of the lyrics themselves, when you put it into the context of, the actual bigger picture of humanity and its role in kind of understanding its own destiny. And what does it mean to be running up that hill? Because that's sort of the image that is conjured up through the lyrics the most. And what would it be like if God had to experience what we experienced? Now, of course, in my understanding of God, God is experiencing what we experience because God lives through us. We are part of God. But the sort of whimsical idea, I think, that is just sort of loosely played with, though I do think it could be explored further. It's just leaving the door open for that kind of speculation. Is, the grass is always greener or going to appear greener on the other side. I'd be running up that hill with no problems. You and me, we wouldn't be unhappy if we could understand and find that equilibrium by seeing the other perspective and finally realizing that it's not actually all that it looks like from where we currently are. I love the vocalizations that she does where she turns a word and makes it the word you, for example, and turns it into a beautiful way to show off her voice and matching the melody line. Very clear, sing-songy kind of quality to some of the ways she handles these notes. So, Hounds of Love is the title track for this album and is probably one of the most extroverted, the most forward-facing, the most optimistic. It opens up with some dialogue from a film called Night of the Demon, where there's a man saying, "It's in the trees, hurry," and that is obviously alluring to like some kind of demon creature that's, haunting you. And she turns it into this concept of these hounds of love, these dogs that are chasing her that represent what love actually is. And so in the lyrics, she's describing the fear of falling in love. And in my state of life right now, I couldn't relate more to this kind of anxiety that surrounds the idea of falling in love. It can feel very much as though you're being chased by something in the shadows or in the dark because you haven't experienced it yet. And obviously, this is coming from the perspective of someone who's never actually fully fallen in love and is interested, is keeping the door open for that to happen. But when they meet someone and they start to feel those feelings, there's a little bit of this war in their heads where there's parts of themselves saying, "I've seen you be hurt. I've seen other people be hurt." These hounds of love, they're fun to snuggle up with, but they can also bite you. Do you really want to take that risk? I love the line, "I found a fox caught by two dogs. He let me take him in my hands. His little heart, it beat so fast, and I'm ashamed of running away." I think that describing this like innocent kind of smaller animal in the paws of something that would be considered a little bit more aggressive and understanding how afraid it was, kind of realizing that you have in some ways been that little fox and your heart is going a mile a minute and you're terrified, but you just have to surrender, and that can be scary. But that is ultimately, when you realize what love truly is, you finally kind of feel like, why did I run away from this all this time? Like, why was I so afraid? I was such a coward. I think out of all of the choruses on this record, this one definitely stands out. And if I had to pick one song on this record that I would recommend someone listen to who maybe is not familiar with Kate Bush or even who isn't so much familiar with like non-pop kind of music, I would say this song because I feel like it grasps the most at what a traditional pop song would want to be, but it's her unique style and spin on it. And it's just infectious. I don't see how you can like not feel a certain kind of emotional release listening to it, at least relating also to the lyrics, but also to the sonics of it, because it literally feels as though the lyrics are depicting of you being chased and your heart beating so fast. You literally feel that in the rhythm. And it has a very distinct 80s sound as well. So that definitely makes it a little bit more grounded in the, synthesizer laden kind of 80s music that was popular at that time. But like I said, it doesn't feel dated. It just definitely has a nod more to that era. The Big Sky. Madonna has a song called Ray of Light. And after listening to The Big Sky several times, I can't help but think that maybe Madonna was a little inspired by The Big Sky because there's very similar in terms of lyrics and in terms of the way the song becomes this exuberant celebration mixed with a sort of almost electronic breakdown. And the way she uses her vocals to sort of express all of this, what feels like this pent up kind of energy, just matches that aesthetic of Ray of Light, which both are, slightly different in terms of obviously they're 10 years apart in age, and Ray of Light is definitely a lot trance influenced and much more electronic. The Big Sky has but slightly more kind of grounded orchestral backing, which starts to blend into a lot of the other songs on this record, where there's some very rich cellos that carry this emotional swell back and forth. It's almost like it's almost like being on the sea, and the cellos are kind of like rocking you back and forth. Like there's this feeling of tumultuous waters. But the big sky just opens up and celebrates this kind of newfound, sense of exploration, the sense of being, like Florence's song, How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful, that comes to mind as well. Just being swallowed up by the expanse of possibility that the sky often represents for most people. I think it's very interesting that she's talking about clouds and what they might look like. She says, that cloud looks like Ireland. Come on and blow it a kiss now, but quick, because it's changing in the big sky. So the clouds are changing form, and that mirrors in a lot of ways different possibilities that come up in your life. You got to grab them while they're there, because just like a cloud in the sky, it doesn't last there forever. And you have to be proactive in creating and choosing what to interact with. So I'm getting a lot of that sort of metaphor coming through. Mother stands for comfort. Now, if anything, this is the one song on the first side of this record that feels a little bit more down-tempo and a little bit low-key and experimental. I almost could see it sitting in the second half of this album, actually better than the first. In describing this song, Kate has described it being about, obviously, the love of a mother towards her son, but about a love of a mother towards a son who has committed wrong, possibly a murderer, and that complicated relationship that a mother would have to their own child if they committed such an atrocious act. Am I the cat that takes the bird? To her the hunted, not the hunter. Mother stands for comfort. Mother will hide the murderer. Mother hides the madman. Mother will stay mum. The lyrics, after reading them out loud, they feel kind of awkwardly placed. And there's something about the songwriting of hers that's very, very blunt in certain places. And maybe I'm used to songwriters kind of masking that with more different kinds of euphemisms and alliterations and allusions. But reading it without listening to it, because listening to it, I don't really listen so much to the lyrics. I kind of just, the song kind of just envelops you in its sonic layering, and that synthesizer really stands out. And it could get a little grating. I will say this is not one of my favorite songs on this record, mainly because I just don't really get its positioning so much in the grand scope of this record cohesively. I feel like it's sort of one of the only songs that stands out. And it's interesting, but it goes a little bit into a vaguer, sort of hazy direction that doesn't also connect with all the other songs in the same way. That being said, it still is an oddly comforting song, even though there's something slightly off about the sonics with it. It's done intentionally, I do believe. Cloudbusting. Now, this is an interesting one. This is a really cinematic track. You can't help but envision the, barren sort of fields and rolling hills of Britain when you imagine, the Wuthering Heights kind of character, like her debut single. This song is composed in a much more literary context. She is an avid reader, so a lot of her lyrics come directly from influences from different writers and different novels that have impacted her. There's a novel or a memoir by Peter Reich from 1973 called A Book of Dreams, and this explores the relationship between Peter Reich and his father, Wilhelm Reich, and his memories of being with his father who is a protege of Sigmund Freud, and he is a psychologist and philosopher who also does a lot of mechanical experimentation, scientific experimentation. So they often spend a lot of time creating a machine which would create rain. So it would manipulate weather. It was called a cloudbuster, this machine, and they would point it up at the sky. But eventually, Wilhelm, his lab is raided by police officials, and he is arrested. And the son Peter has to reconcile with his father being taken away from him, and him having to carry on using this cloudbuster and continuing this experiment. I don't know the actual context of this whole story, but it's a very specific reference. And Peter Reich has said that this song was a really wonderful thing for him to hear, because it was inspired by his memoir, but it was broadened to be so much more about a father-son dynamic. And that sort of youthful kind of, I want to be like my dad and I want to create what he's creating and I want to finish what he started. This sort of generational bonding that I think comes across. The cello is so rich in this track, and if anything, it kind of overtakes a lot of the rest of the instrumentation, and it really is just Kate's brazen, celebratory vocal kind of just rolling over what feels like the hillsides as she's just singing very kind of autobiographically as if she went through these things. You know, I still dream of Organon. That was the farm where this took place. I wake up crying, you're making rain, and you're just in reach. When you and sleep escape me, you're like my yo-yo that glowed in the dark. What made it special made it dangerous, so I bury it and forget. But every time it rains, you're here in my head, like the sun coming out. I just know that something good is going to happen. I don't know when, but just saying it could even make it happen. That lyric really makes me think of Björk and her song Big Time Sensuality, where she sings, something big is coming, something big is about to happen. So this song is a perfect example of a sort of literary adaptation of a story into song that I think is a staple of Kate Bush's craft. And the music video features Donald Sutherland as the father, Wilhelm, and then the little boy, and it recreates the whole scene. And it was this thing that they actually showed in theaters, I believe, when the actual single was released and the music video was released. And it was this big thing. Okay, so now we move into the second half, which actually, to be completely honest, I'm much more excited to talk about. The Ninth Wave. This is a body of work that at some point, it's so exciting for me to talk about, but it's also so difficult because of the existential weight that comes across in all of these songs. Cohesively, this is a narrative that Kate has described being about someone who is lost at sea, presumably from a shipwreck or being thrown overboard or what have you. And they're floating, they have a life vest, but they're just floating in the ocean. And they have to spend an entire night just floating on the waves before they are rescued in the morning. And that whole experience and fear, existential fear for your own life and all the things that go through your head are processed through all of these songs. So the first song is called And Dream of Sheep. This is my favorite song on this record, and I think it's probably one of Kate Bush's best songs, although I will confess I have not heard all of her music. But I don't really see her being able to top this simplistic, overly emotional piano ballad that speaks of the absolute forlorn fear of just being abandoned in the middle of the ocean. And the biggest fear is when you are, like, presumably just floating in the water, you can't fall asleep. Because if you fall asleep, you're going to turn over and you're probably going to drown. You're very likely going to drown and die. So the last thing you want to do is fall asleep, but you're just floating here and you're like, what else am I going to do? And you, as she sings, are just this light in the black vastness, waiting to be rescued. The picture that she paints is one of absolute sorrow and despondency. It's really gut-wrenching. From what she delivers in what could be considered a very simple melody structure and song is just so heart-wrenching. And the illusion at the end of, and I just want to fall asleep and dream of sheep. And then there's this beautiful, what sounds almost like a whale sound, like calling off in the distance from these flutes that give it a bit of a lullaby feel towards the end. I mean, it just really bites. I mean, this song is just impossible not to tear up to. It's definitely a song that requires all of your attention, I believe, and it's something you want to just listen to, close your eyes, and just feel if you want to get the full effect from it. Kate Bush actually made a music video for this song when she did her residency in 2014 in London. She performed a lot of these songs live for the first time, and she made a music video showing herself in a body of water with Life Vest, and I actually saw that when it came out. That was like a couple years ago. And at that point, I had no context, and I wasn't really into Kate Bush. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. I knew there was something beneath the surface that was just so inexplicably gorgeous and heart-wrenching, but I didn't feel at that point like I could make that step because I was just like, oh boy, that's territory. I don't want to go in there. I don't want to go in those murky waters right now. That's going to take a lot of analysis and a lot of time. Well, finally, I've dived right in. So again, another song I highly recommend you check out if you haven't. Under the Ice is the next track. So this is basically the part where obviously the person does fall asleep. And so the next few songs are all a dream sequence that portray all of the fears that would come across someone who is in this position. So Under the Ice is about someone who is skating on a frozen lake, and you kind of are the person skating because, you know, in dreams you're like a bunch of different entities at once. And then as you're skating, you see something under the ice moving, and you're like, what is this? This dark form. And you realize it's you. You're trapped under the ice. And the absolute fear and dread that is built in the way she uses her vocals and these very biting instrumentals, these cello instrumentals, really hits home the seriousness of the situation. And it's such a dire, ominous track. It's pretty short, but oh my gosh, it really gives me chills just hearing her deliver such a brutal vocal to just dive home the idea of like, she's under there, help her, get her out. How do I get this person out? And that goes into the next song, which is called Waking Up the Witch. This is definitely the darkest song on this record. I could definitely, and I'd heard some people say that this song actually scared them as children because it is just so dark and mysterious. This song is about supposedly being woken up by your friends from out of the ice. And they're like, come out of the water, like, we're here to help you. And so this is, again, in this hallucinatory state. This person is freezing to death in the water. They are suddenly transported to themselves as being a part of a witch trial, basically. But the novel The Witch of Blackbird Pond is about a woman who went a lot of Salem witch trials in the US, the burnings at the stake. And so the lyrics allude a lot to this idea of like the fact that, you know, witches were often, and this is not necessarily written about, but I allude to the fact that witches were often left to, they were thrown into the water, and if they floated, they were considered witches. And if they sunk, then, well, they're not witches, but they drowned. So it's sort of like a lose-lose situation. And so I think the idea of floating in that water might be conjuring up that imagery. And the fact that this person has probably been cast, you know, from a shipwreck and is abandoned, they're thinking, oh my God, you know, this is what those witches felt. You know, this is that kind of sheer terror of being, you know, thrown away by society and just considered beyond evidence that, you know, you're just doomed to die. And she only breaks through at the very end to hear people say, get out of the water, from someone in a helicopter. The production on this track is absolutely, bar none, impressive. I mean, this is that experimental kind of Baroque, Gothic, alternative pop that, you know, some people may think of when they think of Kate Bush. And you can definitely tell where songs from the Dreaming, her previous record, were bleeding through the inspiration to make things that are just so unsettling and so mystifying at the same time. The very harsh kind of devilish vocal from the male, it gets almost too much at a certain point, but that's the point. It's meant to just hit home this absolute terror. I love also, you know, at the beginning, you know, it's these people just telling her to wake up, and I feel like that very strongly because I like to sleep in, and I view depression as this long sleep, and so people are telling you to wake up, and you're trying to find the light to, you know, bring you out of this dark water. I mean, the metaphors are so rich and so vast, just like the ocean that this whole drama takes place in. In the bridge, that was repeated several times, she sings Spiritus Sanctus in Nomine, which means in the name of the Holy Spirit. So obviously we have a lot of religious overtones here to kind of juxtapose that light versus dark, that classic, you know, exorcism, kind of the pastor against the girl possessed sort of narrative, which I love and live for. I love that kind of Gothic stuff. So this song literally feels like an exorcism, and it's treated as such. So we calm down in the next track. The next track is a different kind of dream that someone could have while they're drowning. This one is more mournful and sorrowful, but it's not quite as full of terror. This song is called Watching You Without Me, which I think is a absolutely brilliant title. And this is about visiting the people that you have presumably left behind because you are now dead, because you drowned in the water, and visiting them as a ghost, and they can't see you, but you can see them. And what that would feel like to your heart to watch your loved ones notice your absence. Despite this being a very mournful and sorrowful song, it actually has what feels like a little bit of a slightly more positive and upbeat rhythm to it. It's very kind of interesting in that regard because this person is so desperate. You know, you can't hear me here in the room with you now. You can't hear what I'm saying, and I'm not here. Ultimately, reconciling with that. Let me in. Don't ignore me. Again, some wonderful, beautiful vocal runs. A really exquisite track that bears like very close listening with headphones because of all the rich sonics and layers. Jig of Life. So she went to Ireland during the recording of this record. And this was one of the songs that she composed at that point. And so this is a third kind of hallucinatory song. And this is about this is about her future self coming and saying, look, you've got to fight for your survival. You can't just fall asleep and just give up. Look at all of the things that are going to happen, that could happen in your life. And let me live, girl. This moment in time, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. Like, this is your future self saying, you have to get out of this situation because my life is at stake here too, even though we're the same person. And this is that kind of representation of the future and the promise of the future kind of represented in that sort of scope. Very, very interesting instrumentally, as it definitely has a very distinct Celtic sound in the use of the Irish instruments that are used. Her brother actually is the one who reads the outro at the end of this song, which is, I think, very interesting. He has a long sort of soliloquy portion at the end. And again, you know, some of these songs, they do feel a little bit like they're definitely not singles. These are like periods and stretched out bodies of work that are meant to be listened to cohesively, that are repetitive enough to make you think they're songs, but they're very kind of abstract in form and composition. And they often juxtapose very sort of jarring or upbeat or loud instrumentation with very kind of minimalist, kind of spaced out moments of reflection. So they're very kind of on and off and on and off. The next track, Hello Earth, exhibits that the most. And this song is really intriguing because it features some of the most beautiful, what sounds like Gregorian chanting to me, but it's not. It's actually they're Georgian folk singers vocalizing during what is considered either the bridge or the chorus. It's, you know, it's a little ambiguous because it's repeated, but there's not really a set structure to these songs. It opens up with a conversation between NASA astronauts, which I think is very interesting. The idea of this song is just when you're absolutely kind of given up and you're floating, suddenly the entire night sky is sort of reflected above in front of you, and you can see all the stars. And imagining for a second if that was all inverted and you were floating above the earth and you were watching the earth, in a way similar to how people saw the earth for the first time, you know, when they in the 1969, when that iconic photograph was taken, you know, viewed Earth for the first time from outside of it. It's sort of pulling from that idea. And the woman's strength has completely left her at this point. She's not fighting anymore. She's slowly just surrendering. And this would be the point where you could consider, you know, like, I'm ascending out of Earth, like I'm leaving, I'm going to die. But at the very end, at the very, very end, she's finally rescued and pulled out of the water. And it also just, in the lyrics, just feels so cathartic in that delivery. And I think it has one of the most, again, beautiful melody structures for this album. And the delivery of it just feels so heartwarming, even though it's so sad. You can't separate that out from the concept. The last song, The Morning Fog, is what Kate Bush described as that one happy song that you kind of need because things were getting really dark and heavy. Because the song is kind of just about the morning. It's about, you know, seeing the mists clear and finally being rescued and finally being warm again. And the song actually is quite jarring in how upbeat it is, because it really takes you from what was such a solemn and mysterious and kind of not quite depressing, but very in your kind of feelings track, like Hello Earth, and then it's just like, oh, jolly, like here's the credits and the end of the story. It all ended up happy. But that, was the way she wanted this to kind of structure itself out and play out. The Morning Fog to me is probably actually one of the least sonically interesting songs on this record. I don't really come back to it very much beyond that, and it just feels a bit like a epilogue, because it is a little shorter. But all in all, it closes a 6-song opus that just takes you on a journey that is uncomfortable, that is unnerving, that is spiritual, that is uplifting, that gives you that good cry that you need, that really makes you ponder the big and little things about existence. And through telling a story and using the metaphor and allegory of that story so brilliantly, from just the idea of a shipwrecked person to expanding out into all of these realms of experiential kind of fear and trepidation and wonder, it's definitely a brilliant poetic license that is expanded upon for her in that. And it has gotten, rightly so, tons of critical acclaim from the abstract instrumentation and composition. People rave about the Ninth Wave. It is like this holy grail for many Kate Bush fans and for many alternative art, pop, rock fans of the UK and in the world for that matter. It is rightly listed as one of the best albums of all time, and I definitely agree with that moniker. I think this album stands out as just unapologetic, raw emotion delivered in a very cohesive, brazen, kind of in-your-face package that really hits a message home. And it's got so much layering that you can dissect if you want to. And it's got something for everyone in terms of the sonics, more accessible things and more abstract. Overall, I had to give this album a review. I hope I've done it justice. I know it's pretty lengthy, but there's so much to talk about. So please let me know in the comments what you think about this incredible record. And I know I'm missing things I could talk about, but it's just, I need to wrap this up. So I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble about it. And if it gave any more new insight to your experiences, let me know in the comments of what you think about these songs or any info that you have about the references, because she uses so many literary references. I could not keep up with all of that. Talk about footnotes and endnotes. Like she's the type of artist who in her lyrics, everything would need a footnote, because it'd be like, this is referencing this literary genius from, this century and blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh my God, I can't keep up with all of that. I'm used to being very vague and abstract in that kind of way with lyricism. I do plan on reviewing more Kate Bush eventually. I will say don't hold your breath for another Kate Bush review anytime soon. I mean, obviously, I'm not reviewing a whole lot of old albums anyway currently, but I do have others I do plan to do. So, just as a, FYI, I do plan on reviewing more, but I'm not necessarily going to review all of her records on this channel. Of course, never say never, maybe, way down the line, but just putting that out there for people who are like, I'll now review this record. It's like, I probably will, but it's going to take some time. But I am definitely going to explore Kate Bush more, because there's so much more to her, her catalog that I'm definitely intrigued by. I have definitely become a fan. And I'm glad I finally got on board, because I know I'm pretty late on this. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and please give a like and subscribe if you did. And I will see you all in another review. Thank you so much for watching. Peace, love, and light. Bye.
Let me be weak. Let me sleep.